Hey guys, welcome to episode 5, I believe, of the Dungeon Master's Journal for Out of the Abyss D&D 5th edition campaign book. I'm Anthony, I'm the DM, and I'm taking a group of 5 adventurers through this campaign book. And last night we played our 5th session. So I'm just going to be kind of going through what that was like and having you follow along with the adventures of my group. So I may glaze over some of this opening bit just because... fun fact, I was already recording this video, and I got to a certain point, maybe 10 minutes in, and the computer said, oh, sorry, you don't have enough room, you got to get rid of some stuff before you can make any new pictures or video. Awesome. So this is take 2. But anyways, I want to kind of, first thing I want to point is I've got my nice little Imperial insignia hat on today. The store that I'm part owner of, we received about a week ago our advanced demo copy of Star Wars Legion, the new miniatures game, and I'm very psyched for that. And we spent a week, me and some other members of the community, getting it all painted up and running some demos of it this weekend that just passed a few days ago, and it's amazing. So I'll probably wind up doing a video on my impressions of that too. So if you care about Star Wars or miniature gaming, I hope you check that out. But just wanted to note, and actually, the hat that I'm wearing was actually given to me as a birthday present by one of the players that was at my table tonight. We had a guest player because, you know, I have about, if you've seen my other videos, anywhere between 4 and 5 party members. It's 5, realistically, but oftentimes we have one person that can't make it, which leaves us at 4, which is fine. But last night, we had 2 members that couldn't make it. One player's a teacher. It was the March break. He was kind of out of town. And another player, she had to work. So we were missing Uta, the Turtle Monk, and we were missing Bard, the half-orc barbarian. So they were not there. And with the encounter, if you remember where we last left off, the adventurers were kind of ending their journey, their 2-week journey down the Dark Lake towards Gracklestugh, at the behest of kind of Hemeth, the dwarf, the deep dwarf they saved, or the dark dwarf, or whatever they're called, the Duergar, as well as Colby Jack, who feels like, I'm part of a merchant's guild, and I think we would have some people there. So they were going off that way, and they ended off hearing a voice that was calling them towards an unknown dark passageway when they were, you know, just a few hours away from Gracklestugh. And the players didn't see anything wrong with that. They took insight checks. They said, no, this just sounds like someone in help. So the paladin and the orc, the half-orc, were basically like, well, we better go and check. And everyone else said, well, yeah, I guess that's fine. So going into this little side, they basically had them encounter a little mini dungeon called the Lost Tomb of Caim, which I was very excited to run them through. And I was afraid, though, that with just 3 parties, they would just all die. Even with 4, it's a challenge. So I asked, we had another player, a mutual friend of us, of myself and the party, very familiar with role-playing, plays a lot of Pathfinder, had not had an opportunity really to try D&D 5th edition, so he wanted to try it, and I said, well, you know what, we could really use another player, and I'll make it easy for you. I'm just going to have you control one of the NPCs that's already been with the party. I'll just give you the character sheet and you can play them. And he said, yeah, that's phenomenal, that's great. So that's what they wind up doing, and so we had a 4-party group, which consisted of our guest player playing Jim Jar, the kind of gnomish rogue or spy. We had Ken LaFlaunt, the half-elf bard. We had Colby Jack, the half-elf warlock, and we had the human paladin, Sir Robert Bastian. So, yeah, so they're kind of going off. They heard this psionic voice in their head say, oh, please help me. You know, it's this woman's voice. I've been lost in the dark for so long. Please rescue me. So they said, yep, that's what we're going to go and do. So they follow this voice, or, you know, it's giving them mental impressions of a door, and they finally find it. And it's this ancient bronze door that's turned green with age, or copper, sorry, not bronze. It turned green with age, and it's kind of wedged in a weird shape into the stone. And so this is the entrance to this tomb, and the door is not locked, and it's stuck. It's just like it takes an athletic strength check to open it. And so after a couple of attempts, and we'll talk about this more in a second because it gets kind of funny. But after a couple of attempts, they pry this door open. And they get inside, and Colby had, you know, there's a new member of the team, so to speak, and his imp familiar Poncho, which he gained at level 3, you know, and had for his last session for the first time, had again today, And he used him to great effect in that, he can be invisible, he can shapeshift, and Colby can see through his eyes. So he used this really well and kind of saying, well, okay, I want Poncho to turn into a spider and crawl under the door if there's a crack and take a look around, and the imp has dark vision, all that kind of thing. So that worked out well, and they were using that to scout, and it added to this comedic element that was kind of first introduced in the last session, where the paladin, it's about Colby using his familiar, his demonic familiar, his fiendish familiar, in such a way that the paladin never sees him. Because if the paladin sees him, he'll just kill him. And killing him is not a big deal. The imp always just kind of comes back. But it's more like the paladin might work out, well, why was this here? And why wasn't it attacking us? And is there a connection between it and someone in the party? That's what the warlock wants to avoid. So anyways, so scouts out the first room, doesn't see anything. They open the door and go in, and it is just this, it's completely pitch black. There's no source of light. And the paladin is the only one in the party without dark vision, so he says, well, I light a torch, which I thought was great. Great because it's practical, but also because it added great ambiance. You're in this underground stone crypt, and the only light source is this like flickering torch, and the only sound is the crackling of the torch, and I thought it was great. So they go in, and this room is just ancient. It's covered with a thick layer of dust, and the only thing that was in this room is this stone diorama right to the right. And they're looking at it and they say, well, seems to be this noble woman in fine dress, surrounded by attendants, slaves, wealth, and in the background is what appears to be a beautiful vista of floating cities. And a couple of the characters, the paladin and the bard, said, well, do I know what that is? I said, well, you can go ahead and take a history check. And they didn't roll well enough to know what it was. Their characters wouldn't have recognized it. But they did roll well enough that the bard would have said, they would have said to themselves for respective reasons, this is not a work of fiction. This is not embellishment. This was a real thing. Maybe I heard a story about this. Maybe I studied this at a temple. But it's escaping me what this is. So the only way for them to go there is directly down a set of stairs. That goes pretty down. So they take the set of stairs, and they wind up in the next room. And this next room is much the same, covered in a thick layer of dust. There's a big stone altar on one side, rich kind of torn tapestries on the wall, but there's gouges in the stone. Now, the party didn't realize or didn't roll to recognize that this damage was relatively recent. But at the same time, there's an absence of footsteps in the dust, which would have helped indicate, what kind of creatures they might have been fighting. But that was okay, because the paladin has like divine sense that he likes to use in situations that make him nervous. And so he used this, and I said, yeah, you feel like restless spirits through the door to the north. So there's undead danger that way. And, he says to the group, something stirs in the room up north. We should tread carefully. And so he also does a religion check on the altar. And he rolls much better on his religion check. So I say, the diorama upstairs is starting to make sense now. Because once you start looking at these objects in a religious context, you don't necessarily recognize what specific god these might be to. However, you do recognize the culture as being the Netherese culture. And the Netherese culture, the Netherese Empire, was this massive, powerful, magical empire centuries ago that kind of ruled the majority of the planet. And they were very advanced. They lived in floating cities above the sky, very powerful casters. So that's what this is. You're basically inside of a Netherese tomb. And they say, oh, okay, that's interesting. So they decide, well, then let's investigate where the danger is. Let's go through this door to the north. So they go in there, and they see that they enter into a smaller room down a hallway that has 4 sarcophagi, one in each corner. And the paladin says, the restless spirits are in these sarcophagi. So they're like, oh, we better be careful then. So they go in and nothing's happening. Then they say, well, we want to do an investigation check and like a perception. So they're just kind of searching the room without touching anything. And they rolled really well. So I said, okay, well, on each of the sarcophagi, you see that it's got etched on it a identical symbol or picture, which is the image of a robed figure in repose. And more so, you find that the northeast one seems to be built on hidden rollers. Like the tomb is slidable, kind of thing. And they said, really? And the warlock says, okay, well, I want to I want to move, I want to slide the thing. I said, okay, so do a strength check. It was easier to open the doors. It is on rollers, so they succeed. I said, you move it aside, and it reveals this 4-foot wide hole in the floor that just is darkness below. Or he has dark vision, so you just see a stone floor maybe 10 feet down, which eventually the paladin would drop his torch and say, yep, it's 10 feet down. But then, as you do that, as you see this hole, they've at this point disturbed the sarcophagi. So these 4 specters in these tattered robes, very ethereal looking, fly out of their respective sarcophagus, kind of screaming and moaning. And so, I was really excited for this encounter, and I knew it would be difficult, but I wasn't quite sure how difficult. But I knew it would be difficult because they're specters. They're ethereal, right? So they have damage resistance to almost everything. So all the damage being done is probably going to be halved because the party has no magic weapons. And on top of that, they even have immunity to things like necrotic damage, as well as poison damage. And the little imp can do a lot of poison damage. And the hex that the warlock likes to use adds a d8 of necrotic damage. So all that stuff was useless. And then on top of that, there's a whole bunch of condition effects that they can't be put under. No restrained, no prone, no charmed, all that kind of stuff. So I was interested to see how this fight was going to go. And the other thing to note about these specters is that they're like a glass cannon. Like, they have low AC, easy to hit. They have a relatively low pool of hit points. I think like mid to low 20s. But the thing is they hit like a truck. They use this attack called Drain Life, which is the only attack they have. And, if it hits you, it's doing something like 3d6 necrotic damage. And then you have to take a DC check, and if you fail, it's a relatively low DC, but if you fail, your maximum hit point pool of what you can be healed back to drops by that same amount. And if you ever fail that check and it drops your temporary maximum hit points to 0, you outright die. So I was afraid of this. I was afraid for the party. So they go to battle. The warlock is the only one who can really do a decent amount of damage because he's throwing around Eldritch Bolt, which does force damage, which the spirits have no resistance to. So they're fighting and they're doing that, and the rest of the weapons seem ineffective. Robert Bastion smites one of them and really just one-hit kills it. I mean, obviously the radiant damage of the smite and the bonus damage versus undead is going to be very useful. So he drops one. And then there's only 3 left to deal with. But then he made a bit of a mistake. Is he thought, well, I want to help this warlock out who's being attacked because he has a lot of abilities that impose disadvantage and that kind of thing. So he moves away out of combat and says, so that guy's going to get an attack of opportunity on me. And I was like, okay. So I rolled, and it hit, and it downed him, and he almost was brought down to his 0 and almost just died outright. That was his first brush with death this session. But we'll get back to that. So he's down, and the warlock is trying his best to fling spells, and Jimjar's shooting his crossbow, getting his sneak attacks, but it's obviously not that effective. The imp is attacking, and his poison's not doing anything. And the bard is just trying to be clever with his spells and do some healing and that kind of thing. So long story short, is that 2 of the characters severely had their max HP dropped, which lasts until the next long rest. And on top of that, the paladin was downed. They got him back up, and they killed the rest of the specters. But it was a tough fight for them. It was, and it got scary at a couple points for a few of the characters. But eventually, they got rid of all of those ghosts. They would shoot a crossbow bolt at it, and it would go through it like a wisp of smoke and just cause some discomfort. But interestingly enough, Jimjar actually kind of coup de grace 2 of these ghosts because he rolled really well with sneak attacks, and even though the damage was halved, it was enough that it was like you shoot and it goes through them, but they just kind of scream and puff into dust and ectoplasm, and they're gone. So that was kind of fun. So the combat was over. They healed themselves a little bit. They took a short rest, which I allowed. Okay, you can take a 15-minute breather after your really intense encounter there, and then they want to start investing. Do we go down this hole? And Ken is like, no, why are we even here? And he's chaotic neutral, so this is fine. And he's like, this is a terrible idea. We should not be here at all. We should just leave. And the other characters are, either lawful good or chaotic good or whatever. And they're like, well, we can still hear that woman calling for help. Like, we should really, you know, deal with her, and we need to help her. So they say, well, how about first, let's open the sarcophagi. Let's see what's going on there. So there became this funny dynamic of the warlock would try and open a sarcophagus, and it wouldn't work. He wouldn't roll high enough on his strength check. And then the paladin would come over and just be like, okay, there you go. And, you know, this happened a couple times, and then it happened every single time, and it became this joke that the warlock would be like, all right, nothing would happen, and then the paladin would just kind of stare at him and walk over and go, boop, and then the sarcophagus would open. So in every sarcophagus, they found the mummified remains of, I guess, whatever these spirits were. But each one has some treasure. They scored some good loot. No usable items, no magical items. But the book does give really great description on what some of these things are. Like, they found this really nice polished wooden walking stick with like a golden scorpion handle, and like a ceremonial ivory wand. You know, they were checking, like, are these magical? Like, I do an arcane check. Do I notice anything? It's like, nope, just seems very unmagical, but very well crafted. So it was just some treasure for them to nab. So before they jump into this whole, like, well, there was another door in that other room. Why don't we check through that door? So they go through a double set of doors kind of thing that leads into this other room. Again, very old, but it has a massive coffin, like a massive sarcophagus in the middle of the room, made of black marble. You know, with a picture, a mosaic on it of floating cities, and a couple shelves with these canoptic jars filled with like desiccated organs. You know, very Egyptian-y kind of feel. So the bard says, Ken LaFont goes over and says, "Oh, investigate these jars and open one and smell it." And it's like, well, it's awful because it's organs that have been there forever. And so he's like, ugh, and he kind of like looks around and smashes a few of them, and nothing happens. But eventually the paladin says, okay, so Sir Robert says, I'm going to open up this sarcophagus. So he does a strength check and an arcana check, and basically notices that he puts too much force into it. Like, the lid flies off this thing because it's been enchanted to be much lighter than it is. So the lid slides off, and they see this marble painted lifelike statue of a noblewoman that looks made to look like she's sleeping. All right, and there's nothing else other than that. But as soon as they do this, they hear this big booming voice basically say, like, "Oh, you have disturbed the tomb of Brais of Caim, and you are accursed, terrible creatures." And it's this magic mouth spell that is cursing them. Everyone in the room. So they all had to take a charisma saving throw. Half of them made it, half of them didn't. I said, okay, for those of you who didn't, you are now cursed. You have disadvantage on all saving throws and attack rolls until, you know, 24 hours from now, when you can try the check again and try and pass it, or you'll just continue to be cursed. So they were like, oh, of course, you know, that sucks. So there's nothing else in this room. So they say, well, I guess we better check out that hole. So they send the imp down, and they kind of scout the room, and the imp rolls its perception really well, and it's, you know, it's very kind of perceptive little creature. And so you say, well, you see another room, again, relatively small. This has a gilded gold coffin down there, like a gold sarcophagus against the wall. And as he's searching around, he tries to round the corner and bumps into something that's like not there. And he notices that at the foot of one of the coffins, or sorry, at the foot of the only sarcophagus in the room, there is an invisible stone chest. Now at this point, only Colby knows that information because he sees through his familiar eyes. But he basically says, well, it doesn't look like there's anything down there. So the paladin and the warlock both jump down the hole. Well, they don't jump down. They would have taken some potential falling damage. They had rope on them. So they kind of tied off rope to one of the sarcophagus and just kind of rappelled down this 10-foot hole. And, you know, it's like, yep, it's exactly as I described you. There's like, you know, murals on the wall inlaid with semi-precious stones and this big sarcophagus. And then at that point, Brais of Caim, whose tomb this is, who is the woman that they keep seeing depicted, rises as a wraith out of this tomb, out of this sarcophagus, and just starts screaming like, oh, you pathetic fools, you know, your life force will help me escape this prison, and just goes insane, and the combat begins. The wraith is gross, and it could have been grosser, but they did play it well for the most part. Again, not a high AC, but like 60 to 70 HP, and when it hits, it's like doing an average of 20 odd damage that's necrotic. And again, you have to check to see if that's gonna, it's a life drain, so it could drop you and just outright kill you. And this is in fact what happened to the paladin, is he got destroyed. After like one round, or maybe even before he got his first round, the wraith just basically sunk its hand into his chest and squeezed his heart and drained the life out of him, and he just dropped. He was just perma-dead. And it was like, oh, well, there's the first PC death. And at this point, I mean, I didn't want the character, or rather the character, I didn't want the player to just sit there doing nothing. So I printed off, actually I have it right here, I printed off the kind of statistics for Sereth, the Dark Elf that's been in their party, the Drow, and said you can play Sereth in this encounter, you know, for the rest of the session tonight, and then you can roll up another character later. Because, yeah, he was dead. So at that point, though, it was like, okay, well, this is all the same immunities as the Spectre, but it's much nastier, and now half the party is cursed. So it was a dire situation. So they're doing this fight, and I guess highlights of the fight are that the Warlock, I'm pretty sure it was the Warlock, it might have been Jimjar, one of the casters anyways, blinded the Wraith, which was phenomenal. Like, now, because the Wraith is not immune to being blinded. So it's blinded, and it now has disadvantage in all its attacks, and they get advantage in all their attacks. And the cursed members, the advantage and disadvantage cancel each other out, so they're just doing regular rolls. It was realistically the best thing that could have happened. So they're wailing on this thing, and it's trying to attack them, and it's sitting there and cackling and screaming and saying, you know, I'm going to destroy you all. And half of the party is too afraid to go down into the hole. They're like, we don't want to deal with that. And so eventually what happened is after the first round of combat, the characters hear this woman's voice again, that called them to this tomb in the first place, and says, quickly, in the sarcophagus, I can help you. And they're like, oh. So then it's Jimjar's turn. I'm pretty sure he like rolled to go first, and he says, okay, I rappel down into the hole and do like an acrobatics to bounce myself off the wall and flip in front of the sarcophagus. And he, you know, they do an acrobatics check, and he failed enough that, you know, he made the move, but, you know, took D3 bludgeoning damage, kind of landed wrong. And then he says, okay, I open the sarcophagus, and I say, well, in the sarcophagus you see the mummified remains of Baris of Caim, and on her chest is what appears to be a gold gilded heft of a sword, you know, like the crossguard and handle of a sword, but no blade. And he says, oh, okay. And I'm like, look, you've done quite a bit. You know, you did a move and an acrobatic move, and you opened this thing, which is the only sarcophagus that doesn't require a check to open, apparently. And I'm like, so that's enough. That's your turn. So they go through another round of combat. This thing smacks one of the party members, and, you know, does some decent damage, and they're continue to beat on it as much as they can. So then we come back to the top, and it's Jimjar's turn again, and he says, well, what do you do? He says, well, I grab the hilt of the sword, I guess. And I said, okay. So you take this hilt, and as you're holding it, because this thing's basically a lightsaber, I'm going to be honest with you, you basically hear like a and this glowing blade of pure radiant energy extends like a longsword out of it. And you hear the voice in your head again that says, thank you, I've been trapped in the dark for so long, and now we're going to destroy this foul creature, you know. And at that point I said, well, I got to stat this thing for you. So we took a quick breather so I could give him all the information. And basically what he's just discovered, and what's called him to this dungeon, is this ancient legendary artifact called Dawnbringer. And Dawnbringer is basically a modded version of a Sunblade from the Dungeon Master's Guide. So it is a +2 longsword. All the damage it does is radiant damage. It gains an extra D8 when it attacks anything that is undead of damage, which again is more radiant damage. It can touch a creature. Now, I'm not sure where the Sunblade ends and Dawnbringer begins, but it can touch a creature and cast Lesser Restoration to get rid of things like, you know, poison and paralysis and stuff like that. On top of that, it sheds bright light within 15 feet, and another 15 feet out after that is dim light. And it's all considered sunlight, not just light. It is sunlight. And as a bonus action, you can either increase or decrease the amount of light that the sword is shedding. And then what kind of makes it really cool for me as the DM, what kind of I think puts it over the top, is that in addition to being this great sword that is obviously going to be of good use to them now, but in addition to being this really cool sword that I wanted the paladin to have, but he died, is, it's a sentient weapon. It has an intelligence score, a wisdom score, a charisma score. It has its own personality. It can speak any language that the person attuned to it can speak. It speaks telepathically with its wielder, and it has hearing and dark vision out to like 120 feet. Like, this is basically an additional party member, in some sense, but is just a piece of equipment. Very, very, very cool. So happy that they decided to go investigate this tomb, and he has the sword. So I say, so you've got this insanely cool sword, and so Jim Jar goes and just starts carving pieces out of this wraith, just destroying it. And now the wraith, it's sunlight sensitive. It's in the sunlight. It's a bad day for it. Insofar as the bard Ken LaFlaunt eventually casts a spell that makes it run away. It retreats 60 feet. So 60 feet puts it through a wall, but it's a ghost, so it can do that. But before it left, on its last activation, it created a specter out of Sir Robert Bastian that can do that. It says if a creature has died a violent death and has not been dead for longer than a minute, then it can raise a specter out of it. So that's what it does. So the specter is still there. The wraith is taken off. So now they're fighting the specter. They kill the specter, but then that kind of flee move they forced the wraith to do only lasts for a turn. So it moved 60 feet, and then it just came 60 feet back, screaming through the wall. But they killed it. I mean, had taken so much damage from things like the Warlock, and then especially Jim Jar with Dawnbringer. They destroyed it at that point. And so, the Ken LaFlaunt goes down the hole and kind of sees that Sir Robert has been slayed, and kind of, tries to wake him up and cast Cure Wounds on him. And I say, and you see the wounds on his body close, but he's dead. He doesn't wake up. And, all my characters, I think, all my players are pretty good role players. And it was a great role play moment where, I think I mentioned in a previous video that Ken LaFlaunt has a theoretical dead wife that he talks to, like her apparition, her ghost, and no one's really sure if she's real or not. But to Ken, she's very real, and he sometimes talks to her, and other characters like, "What are you doing, dude?" But anyways, so he casts the spell, and Sir Robert's wounds heal, but he doesn't come back to life. And Ken says, "What? No, this is just like my wife. No, not again." And he just kind of weeps over his body. And at that point, the Warlock, who kind of accepts the situation for what it is, says, "Well, I mean, we got to keep going. I want to check what's in this stone chest." So he opens the stone chest, and inside he finds a bunch of treasure, like lots of monetary wealth. But in addition to that, things like greater healing potion. I think there was a filter of love, which I don't even know what that does, but it sounds like it could be cool. There was another potion in there that I don't quite remember right now. And then I say, and at the bottom, under all of this stuff, is like a piece of paper, like maybe a scroll that looks like it's been unraveled and pressed flat to the bottom. And so you pick this up, and it's some kind of scroll. And he says, "Well, I want to see if I can read it." So he does a check, and he rolls really crappy. And I'm like, "Yeah, you don't know what it is." He's like, "Well, what is this?" I say, "Well, hey, maybe one of the other casters knows, right?" So he kind of takes it over to Ken LaFlaunt and says, Ken, what is this?" And he rolls well. He's like, this is a scroll of raised dead, And at that point, Ken has this dilemma where, as a character, he says, "I could use this scroll to bring my wife back to life." And he's trying to do that. And what was kind of a really sad moment is that the spell of Raise Dead on the scroll says that when you touch a creature, you can then use the scroll to bring it back to life as long as it hasn't been dead for longer than 10 days or something like that. It's either 10 minutes or 10 days. I think it's 10 days. And what Ken is realizing that he's reaching out and he can't touch his wife. And his character is almost coming to the realization that perhaps she is just in his head and he's crazier than he thought he was. And at that point, I actually made the character, upon that realization, take like a madness check to see if he would gain another level of madness, but he passed. So they take the scroll, and they bring the paladin back to life. And at this point, you know, the whole session you've been talking about, well, I guess I got to make another character, and I'm thinking I might make like an elven warrior, because how often do you see that? And la la la, and then he's back. So not only is this paladin back, but now the paladin has access to Dawnbringer, which Jim Jar inevitably decides to give to him because, again, it was like a guest star. Jim Jar is just going to go back to being his old NPC self. But now he's got this sword. He passed the sword over, and him and Dawnbringer have a bit of a small chat, and you know, a connection is made, and yeah, so they grab all the treasure and they gain their XP. They almost hit level 4, but not quite. And they kind of do a long rest in the tomb because they're like, well, this tomb is clear, this house is cleansed, you know, and we know it's defensible. So why don't we take a long rest here before we continue our journey? So they did. They got their spell slots back. They healed up. Their reduced hit point max from the life drain went away because they did a long rest. And at this point, I know it wasn't quite 24 hours, but it would have been by the time they got to Gracklestugh. So I said, okay, go ahead and do your test again to see if you're cursed. And they passed, so they were no longer cursed. So they made their way out of the tome, and Hemeth was like, that was awful and terrible, and let's never do that again. And I don't know why we did that in the first place. Let's just go. So they finally go, and the path they're following is getting more and more refined, getting smoother. Eventually they notice tiles, and it's turning into a road, and they're so used to these uneven passages they've been walking, like, this is amazing. So they get up there, and all of a sudden, in front of them at the end of the passage, they see this large stone wall and iron set gates, and then a slit opens in the stone before where there wasn't one, with a crossbow pointed at them, and then 12 other slits kind of open with more crossbows pointed down. And then they hear this clanking of metal, and they look behind them, and out of thin air, like 12 heavily armored Duergar with shields and spears pointed at them are in like phalanx formation behind them. And the guy at the gate says, you know, halt! What are you doing here? What's your business? All that kind of thing. And this is Gracklestugh. This is the Duergar city, or the Duergar city that they've been looking for. And they're very military there, and they're a lawful evil race, and all that kind of thing. And so it's good that they had Hemeth with them if they were going to try and get in the front gates like this. And Hemeth basically said, look, you know, it's I, Hemeth, you know, I'm a resident here of the city. I'm honor bound to these adventurers. They saved my life, and I'm using my credit, you know, I take it on my reputation that they can enter the city. Now, if it had been a character trying to argue that, if it had been anything else, I would have had, you know, persuasion check, you know, blah blah blah. But you know, it's a fellow Duergar. It is someone that the guards know because he's an arms dealer, and you know, and they operate on a strict set of laws, you know. So they said, okay. I said, all right, you can go. That's fine then. Kind of gives him the eye. And he's like, all right, you can go in. He's like, however, you know that they're foreigners, and so you must take them immediately to the docks. And they, you know, that's where the foreigners go. So Hemeth says, yeah, sure. So the gates open and they enter the city. And Hemeth says, okay, these guards are going to escort you now to the docks. I've fulfilled my part of the bargain. I'm out. And the character's like, whoa, is there anywhere we could find you later? And he's like, if you look in the, you know, the Blade Market, and he names off an inn, that it's the Something's Lair. It's a weird Duergar word that basically translates to like a boulette, like a land shark. And it's the only, they don't know this yet, but maybe I won't even mention that thing because I know they're gonna watch this video, I'm sure, especially the members of my party that weren't there last night. But he said, you can find me at this inn perhaps as well. And then he just takes off because he's like, I'm done. Like, and that's the nature of these evil dwarves, so to speak, is that they do have a sense of duty and honor. That's the lawfulness in them. They have a set of laws that they will abide by, but they're also evil. Like, they don't care about you. And, you know, I said, you know, well, Jim Jar is from the Underdark. Sereth is from the Underdark. Ken has been roaming the Underdark. You know, Colby has merchant connections. So I had them all do like these history checks, and they rolled well. And I was like, hey, here's what you know about Gracklestugh. Here's what you know about the Duergar. And, you know, it's like there's little or no crime because everyone can turn invisible at will. And that means that there's little to no crime. Any intentional crime is basically just handed a death sentence because it's a waste of resources. It's not pragmatic to do mutilation or imprisonment or whatever. It just is an easier, less of a burden on the state to say, well, you did this, so now you die. Now, if accidental crime is committed by a Duergar, that can often be worked out, held in front of a council, and that can be repaid through goods or services of equal, damages or whatever, right? But even if an outsider were to commit a crime, they are legally able to be summarily executed by any Duergar there. That would just be fine. So that's kind of the environment that they're walking into. And I made it clear that this is a very large city. There's a population of over 12,000 people, and those are just the population of the non-slaves, because the Duergar operate on a slave economy. They buy and sell slaves. They have slaves that do work for them. So that's what they're walking into, and that's where we ended the session. So, they're now in Gracklestugh, and I said, Gracklestugh is like an adventure on its own, guys. We're, judging by the fact that I thought that tome might take us a quarter to half the session, and realistically it took us the whole session, we're probably going to be in Gracklestugh. I mean, you guys can do whatever you want, you can leave whatever you want, but if you see Gracklestugh through, so to speak, then we're going to be here for a little while. This is almost like a mini adventure. So they said, yeah, that's fine. Then, we'll do what we deem. So I said, okay, that's great. So that's where we ended it off. They're now in Gracklestugh, and they've got Dawnbringer, and their paladin has had a couple brushes with death. And now they're going to have their first opportunity to see what civilization is like in the Underdark, real civilization. And it'll be their first opportunity to do shopping. They haven't had an opportunity to really buy anything, and they've got treasure to try and sell and all kinds of stuff. So I, as a DM, have a lot of prep work to do for next Sunday, and I'm hoping that all of my players are able to make it, because it's going to be a lot of fun, and it's going to be very interesting. There's going to be a lot of information to glean, and we'll just see what happens next. So that's episode 5 of the DM's Journal. Thanks for watching. Again, always appreciate a like or a subscribe or whatever. Much appreciated, and it's fun for me to do these videos, and I've gotten a lot of people that I know personally who watch them and said, oh, it's great, I love keeping up. Some people who can't get the time to play, I'm playing vicariously through you guys, so that's really great to hear. So enjoy the rest of your day or evening, and I hope you come back and join us for episode 6 as our players explore Gracklestugh. Okay, bye now.